The Jewish position on physician-assisted suicide, physician-assisted dying, basically we are absolutely against it for a very simple reason. Life was given to humanity by God, and physician-assisted suicide is the wrong solution to what is a real problem. We're not going to deny the problem. There is a problem in end of life of excruciating suffering and pain, and psychologically feeling that life is unbearable and life is worthless, and to simply turn our eyes away from people that are feeling that way would be callous and cruel. But what physician-assisted suicide is saying is, the person cries out and says, my life is worthless and unbearable. And we're simply saying, yes, you're right. Your life is worthless and unbearable. Let us help you end it. Is making the wrong statement. What we have to do is, number one, we have to give people hope. We have to give people strength. We have to give them a sense that their life is worthwhile, even when it's difficult. And on the medical side of things, we have to strengthen palliative care and helping people through pain. For many, many years, Baruch Hashem, it's gotten a little better on the medical side. For many, many years, pain relief was virtually ignored. For example, many doctors would not give patients an opium pump because they thought the patient would become addicted. And in truth, if a person's going to live only 2 more weeks, what is so bad if they become addicted? But we've also discovered that when patients are put in charge of administering their own opium doses, or morphine, I should say, not opium, morphine, we find that they actually use less than a physician would have prescribed, and they manage their pain very well. If you look at the surveys, it is true, and I won't deny it, that a majority of the American population is in favor of some limited right of suicide. But if you look at the underlying data, it is because of the tremendous fear that people have, that they will be stuck with unbearable pain at the end of their lives. And I have to say that I have it on very, very good opinions of great expert physicians, that this is largely untrue, that we've developed all sorts of ways of controlling, moderating pain. And this doesn't mean putting somebody in a coma, where a person could live a life and interact, etc. And if people understand that in every stage of life there's hope, in every stage of life there's a potential for accomplishment, if people understand that they're loved and they're cared about, then a lot of the attachment to these wrong solutions would simply differ. Now, I don't want to be alarmist, and I certainly don't want to prove things by anecdotes, but let me point out that one of the first things that Nazi Germany legalized back in the early 1930s was a form of physician-assisted suicide. And ethicists have pointed out that there's a real slippery slope. When does suicide, I want to die, turn into euthanasia, you should be killed because you're a burden on society? And then, who defines who is a burden? And once we start saying that some lives are not worth sustaining, that could be extended to all sorts of categories. So I think if you look at the medical history of Nazi Germany, you see that physician-assisted suicide is a real slippery slope that can lead to very, very dangerous consequences. But I want to emphasize, I'm not pitching Judaism's opposition on what it may lead to. Even if it would lead to nothing else but the suicide of people who are in terminally ill conditions, it is essentially a surrender to the forces of the world without recognizing the greatness of the human spirit and the nobility of life. Now, there is another question here which I'll just allude to, and that is, although Judaism would not be in favor of physician-assisted suicide, there may be all sorts of halachic grounds for not aggressively trying to keep people alive. So we would make a very, very strong distinction between anything that actively kills somebody, which is a form of murder, and even suicide is murder, versus not prolonging life in a state of pain. Now, even there, Judaism is largely in favor of keeping people alive, but in consultation with a rabbi and a physician, there may be grounds for not aggressively prolonging life, but that is not the same as active euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. A number of states in the U.S. have legalized it. As you know, it's been legal for a number of years in the Netherlands. And let me point out that one study in the Netherlands determined that over 50% of the assisted suicides were patients who were suffering from treatable depression. If they would have waited a few days, they would have felt differently. So one has to be very, very careful about not demeaning the sanctity of life. The issue of how aggressive we have to be in treating people at the end of life is a very, very complicated question. It's not necessarily one that can be summed up in even in a long soundbite. It would need an hour or 2 hours at least to fully explore. Let me just mention a few parameters. Number one, the first point is that anything that could be characterized as active murder cannot be permitted. So physician-assisted suicide, giving people injections, taking an overdose of medication with the deliberate intention to take your life, no matter how bad life is, or it seems to the person to be, that cannot be countenanced. We do treat suicide as the halakhic equivalent of murder, because what is the difference if you murder somebody else or if you kill yourself? Now, we do understand that in terms of the person himself, if a person may be temporarily insane, we would not necessarily penalize the victim of suicide by denying him burial, but the act of suicide itself is considered to be a sin. So I think that would clearly be on the side of the prohibited. Now, where everything else is kind of controversial, meaning if we are talking about withdrawing treatment or not providing treatment, such as not giving chemotherapy to somebody with pancreatic cancer, so we would differentiate in the following way. This is at least most views. I cannot say every view. Most views would actually say that if medically the patient's life expectancy is very short, that is defined as 12 months or less. Number two, he is suffering excruciating pain that cannot be relieved by standard pain control methods. And number three, he desires not to continue his life. We would not be obligated to do anything that would be treated as extraordinary. We wouldn't have to give him chemotherapy. He would not have to undergo surgery. You would not have to do CPR, chest compression. On the other hand, even under those circumstances, you generally do have to provide hydration, nutrition, and breathing support. You would not have to put him on a respirator, but you would have to give him the oxygen that his body could take in, because withholding food, water, and oxygen are tantamount to active murder, because these are the normal elements that sustain life. Now, even in that connection, however, when a person is very much at the very, very end of things, the body can no longer process nutrients. And indeed, giving him liquids might even cause him to die earlier than otherwise would. At that point, we would stop giving him even the fluids. But that is very, very end stage. The concept of quality of life per se is not a relevant idea, because any life is worthy of sustaining, because there are purposes for a soul to be in the body that we don't always perceive. Sometimes the purpose of a soul in the body is not because of what the body can do, even if it's comatose, but the body enables other people to do mitzvos, such as pray, give charity, and the like. So sometimes the purpose of your life is not what you yourself are accomplishing. The purpose of your life is what you are enabling other people to accomplish. And that is a great spiritual benefit that will serve this soul well when it goes into the world of truth. So we have to be very, very hesitant, but nevertheless, halacha does recognize that pain and suffering may be a justification not to aggressively sustain life, but we would never permit actively shortening it. Now, the passive-active distinction is troublesome not only in halacha, it is also troublesome in secular ethics as well. For example, one might say that not putting somebody on a respirator is passive. But what if somebody is on a respirator and I shut it off or take them off? Am I actively interfering with his breathing, or am I simply removing something which artificially was breathing for him? One could look at even a removal as a passive, in the sense that I'm not introducing something in him that's causing him to die. I'm simply removing external force. So the active-passive is very troublesome when you're talking about discontinuing an existing form of treatment. And that is why you will sometimes find in halachic literature that there is a distinction between not giving somebody something versus discontinuing it once it's there. On the other hand, some have argued that that is an illusory distinction, that in fact, even when you're discontinuing, that is effectively passively, because what is happening is you're not giving him something that would be keeping him alive. So that, I think, would be a middle-of-the-road area, meaning I think halacha would be very clear that there are certain things you don't have to institute. It would be less clear whether discontinuation is called active or passive. So, b'kitzur, therefore, active shortening of life, always prohibited. Passive withholding may be permitted in cases of excruciating pain with short-term survival of less than 12 months. Discontinuing existing therapies gets you into the semantic issue of what is active and what is passive, and that, I think, would be the most questionable area in this field.